Hello, beautiful community. You are the beautiful community, and this is Vlad Reacts, where we scroll, come across something substantive on YouTube Shorts, and we react. We're going to start with Tim Snyder. Tim is an historian and a moralist, a public advocate for folks in Eastern Europe and for Ukraine. Let's go.
If you want to build an authoritarian regime, you try to make the world less about the facts that are between you and me and more about the emotions that will either divide us or bring us together. It doesn't really matter which. Authoritarianism depends upon people getting used to hearing the things that they want to hear, and thereby slowly changes you. I mean, it shifts you away from a person who thinks there are facts out there and more towards a person who just gets used to hearing the things that he or she wants to hear. You shift from being a person who could function in the public sphere, in the democracy, to a person who can't.
Okay. Let me react like this. Between the lines of the things I don't say, almost most important one on the channels is the idea that there's a special connection between truthfulness and liberal democracy with the smallest L and the smallest d. So we're really talking courts, elections, free universities, free media, other counter-majoritarian institutions, and then, of course, a joint conversation about what liberal democracy means and where we're going together. And I think a couple of things here, but I think the second thing is especially fragile, and the fact that it's fragile makes our conversation precious, but fragile. The first is that small L, small d, liberal democracy is the social formation in the modern world, we're not talking about humans in the distant past, that best survives truthful critique, that best survives serious questions being asked about it from the point of view of a truthful understanding of the social world and a truthful naturalistic understanding of ourselves, right? What we understand about ourselves as animals that impinges upon how we exist in society. So there's a special connection that links legitimacy, truthfulness, liberal democracy. But here's the second fragile commitment that I want to make together with those of you who want to come along and those of you who don't. I am saying this stuff can last, and that I hope that it lasts, that it sustains itself, isn't just a flimsy kind of illusion of the sort Mr. Putin would like to think that it is. So let's just refresh the two claims. Truthfulness and liberal democracy are linked. But then on top of that, I'm saying that yes, it is possible for complex, large-scale societies to exist while containing a vigorous, non-emaciated virtue of truthfulness practiced by enough of the citizenry and enough of the society's institutions. And so I'm saying truthfulness and liberal democracy are linked, and that this link can endure because we have some confidence, some grounds for confidence, some grounds for optimism about the sustainability of living in the truth. And this is a fragile claim that I absolutely do not want to say is obviously true, because somebody can come along and say, Vlad, you have your confidence, but in the end, complex societies don't sustain themselves without a great deal of opacity, a great deal of collective deception, collective self-deception. So there may be moments of moment which come and make possible the sustenance of such a social order, but the fact that it's going to persist beyond a couple of blips here and there is a fantasy. I say we don't know, but we have grounds for some confidence about the fact that what we really, really want here is sustainable and it can last. So 2 steps. Truthfulness is linked with liberal democracy. Second step, we have confidence to think that the truthfulness on which liberal democracy depends might well be historically sustainable, right? We can have a truthfully based hope about this. Next is Tony Blair on Putin.
He deserves to be completely defeated. I knew Putin in 2
I've
incarnations.
seen this before. This is an
Even
old
in that
interview.
second incarnation, he was brutal but calculating. My anxiety is we got a third. When I first met him, he was wanting to look westward, and the anxiety I think that everyone has now is that he has become so detached from reality. He's turned Russia into a pariah state amongst the West at least, and crippled his economy. Is he capable of thinking rationally about this in a way that anyone else outside of that closed bubble that he inhabits can relate to?
Okay. So there's the more superficial question of whether Putin has his facts right, and we're going to put that aside. I think in many ways his factual understanding of what's going on has improved, but is also profoundly troubled by paranoia, grandiosity, and isolation. But I don't want to comment on that. I want to comment on where Blair is going with the question of whether Putin is rational. We won't say anything about Blair. We've spoken about the Iraq War before, and this is not the time to give an ethical evaluation of Tony Blair. So let's just look at Putin and rationality. There is a wide sense in which Putin is rational, but there's a narrower sense in which he's not rational. And Putin not being rational in that narrower sense is, I think, one of the more persistent, if not distinctive, and maybe to some degree distinctive themes that keep coming up in my essays on the main channel, my conversations with you here, because I'm saying that Putin is partly motivated by mystical concerns. So let's break this down. The thinner, more basic, more broad sense of rationality, in which Putin is obviously rational, is the sort of rationality that would make a lot of philosophers call an agent rational. That's to say, how are they deliberating? How are they reflecting? Do they have sustained beliefs in justification of which they can speak coherently for 30 minutes flat? Or do their beliefs float about like things that aren't really beliefs but are dispositional states, as is the case with Trump? So according to this broader sense of rationality, Putin is absolutely rational. In fact, I'd say he's more rational than the British Prime Minister, simply because Putin is very, very broken by his grandiosity and isolation. But he is a heavyweight politically. So he thinks a lot about what he's doing. He has deeply reflected upon reasons for his actions, for his omissions to act. So he thinks about what he does a lot. And therefore, in this broader sense, he's clearly a rational agent. But there is a narrower sense of rational agency here, and that is Putin a rational agent in the way that's going to be captured by an economics textbook or by an international relations textbook, or at least a standard international relations textbook? And the answer to that is no, which is why when these types of reductive approaches to the rationality of agents get applied to Putin, as Mearsheimer does, for instance, or some reductive critics in the West who think Putin's just about power and money. When they close the box, Putin isn't inside. And this has serious implications. This means that Putin may well take a big decision on the basis of a kind of mystical vision of his own role in history, or on the basis of a kind of mystical vision of Russia's barely coherently articulable historical need to propel itself from the back row to the front row of nations. It also means he may think more apocalyptically about risk and more apocalyptically about nuclear risk. So we're migrating Putin from a IR and economics textbook exploration that would do quite well actually to capture Brezhnev or Khrushchev, but won't capture Putin. We have to move to a different space. It's not quite the right analogy, but it is a helpful bridge toward a better analogy to say that we're more in the realm of certain kinds of religious fundamentalism than we are in the realm of, 101 international relations, geopolitical considerations. So that's very important. And as you know, historically, I trace that turn in Putin to between 2010 and 2014. And this is currently getting worse in my judgment in him with every 6 months that pass, which isn't pretty, especially if in the years to come a politicization occurs in Russian society, or a greater politicization that aligns more with this mystical evolution and degeneration that Putin is experiencing. That's gone. Next we go to Rory Stewart.
Do I think that Britain is facing an existential crisis? Absolutely not. In historical terms, despite challenges, Britain basically has never been so peaceful, never been so healthy, never been so educated. And people are talking about it as though we're on the verge of some sort of civil war or societal collapse, which I think is ridiculous.
Well, where's that idea coming from if it's so patently absurd?
Well, I think, I'm guilty of doing this occasionally too in other things. It's to do with what you're obsessed with.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly capable of implying that Boris Johnson represents an existential threat to the British Constitution because he's prorogued Parliament, because he's broken the ministerial code. Many of my friends will be very close to suggesting that Donald Trump represents kind of Adolf Hitler. Now, of course, step back for a moment. Obviously, Donald Trump is not Adolf Hitler, right? Obviously, Boris Johnson is not enacting some version of the English Civil War. So this is partly hyperbole, it's partly paranoia, it's partly emotion, it's partly the way in which we construct our world. We are addicted to a sense of crisis.
So I might surprise you, because I always talk about crisis, and I'll continue talking about crisis because I think liberal democracy is in crisis, in an historical crisis. I think we have the biggest crisis of trust in Europe since the revolutions of 1848. But I might surprise you because I'm really happy with what Rory said. And I've never said this in public, but for the last 10 years, I've been saying in private at dinner parties, when I'm well enough to have a dinner party, that we're moving from a very good situation to a good situation, and from there we'll move to a good minus and a good minus situation, and we'll tumble down a bit further than that, but not necessarily more. Now, when I describe what I take to be a good situation and what I take to be a good situation minus, that might feel utterly catastrophic to some people. But that's because we have this prejudice that the future has to be like the recent past, and that the recent past is the version of normal by which all should be judged. But if you say that even the entirety of the 20th century is how we should judge ourselves, judge our situation, then it easily comes out that my anticipation of significant democratic decline in the West and other crises deteriorating, the climate crisis deteriorating, is, at least as far as Western citizens are concerned, nowhere near the pits, the bottom of how disastrously things get. So I therefore don't tie the word crisis, democracy and crisis with crisis and a kind of a descent into the subterranean inferno. And you might say, well, Vlad, how dare you? Like, how dare you say that? Because even in what you call the very good situation, in the year 2000, Western societies had lots of problems. I mean, just look at the situation of the bottom 20% in Western societies. How much structural disadvantage there is, how much people are deprioritized, excluded, how much they live in fear that they can't provide for their family. What very good are you talking about? Well, you see, I'm not somebody who is unaware of these things. In fact, my politics often starts with these concerns. But in historical terms, a society with lots of really dreadful things happening to a lot of people in it is still a society that could be comparatively in a good trajectory in historical terms. I mean, even my own situation, I have a completely neglected, under-researched illness with some awful political obstruction about doing more research too. So I'm very disadvantaged. I don't need to be ill. I don't need to work 2 hours a day. So that's bad. And that's in Britain alone, at least several 100,000 of me. So that's bad. But there's comparison. There's historical comparison, right? If we pull out Thucydides off the shelf and immerse ourselves in war and plague with sort of 30% mortality rate, well, that's different. So there are these scales. And even though I always talk about crisis, I'm not talking about crisis. By crisis, I really mean storms. But by storms, I don't mean storms that sink all the boats. I think it will be give and take with some of the boats that are Western democracies over the next 20, 30 years. And I think a few could topple. But a democracy toppling doesn't mean that, a monster comes and literally eats up everybody in that society. It's something terrible, the way it's terrible in Hungary. So you see, but even the situation in Hungary in historical terms can be placed somewhere along that scale of very good to horrific, and it won't be anywhere near the very bottom. So crisis, yes, but in crisis boats don't sink. Democracy and crisis can coexist quite reasonably. So from a deeply realistic, or you might say pessimistic point of view, I actually think that some of the worse than average case scenarios over the next couple of decades for the West are still, in broad historical terms, for me, in the realm of sort of good to good minus. Economist and public intellectual, left-wing public intellectual, Richard Wolff is next.
If you're going to be paid by an employer $20 an hour, the following statement must be true. During that hour, your labor produces more for the employer that he sells at the end of the day than $20. If paying you 20, you went to work and you did an output that gave another 20 for him to sell, then he's got nothing out of this. He's made 20 by selling what your labor helped to produce, but he's got to give it to you. There has to be in it, here we go, something for him. You have to produce more in every hour than you get paid. Otherwise, this system doesn't work. Those of you who think that in a capitalist system, you're never going to work for anybody who doesn't pay you what you're worth, you don't understand the system you're in. That is never going to happen, because that's how this system works. So that when you go home at the end of a workday and you feel vaguely ripped off, it's because you are.
So what Richard is saying there is that if you employ me and you pay me $20 an hour, you need more value out of that than the $20 you're paying me. At the same time, what Richard is doing there is invoking, I feel, the concept of exploitation. And I think here we've got to just put down a couple of pillars of common sense. We have to recognize the extraordinary downsides and deleterious effects of our economic system, some of which we feel we possibly could control, others we feel we can't. It's an interesting question. How far are some of the worst byproducts of our global economic system are things that we relate to as the ancient Greeks related to slavery? They thought it was horrendous. It was a terrible, nasty practice, cruel practice, but necessary for the sustenance of civilization. So there's all this dreadful stuff happening. There's people in agony while others are sitting around sipping frappuccinos. And there are then important questions about what we can do about it and what we can't do about it. But that's one pillar of common sense. Another pillar of common sense is that if we've got 19-year-old Ricky who's maxed out his credit card on computer games and he's bought 77 Cristiano Ronaldos in FIFA Mobile for his virtual football team with real money without telling his girlfriend, is Ricky being oppressed by global capitalism, and that's happened to him? No, I don't feel he is. And then, having put these couple of pillars, the space that's missing, and of course you can't have a loud silence in a YouTube short because that's clearly part of a lecture Richard gave, and so I don't know what he said in the lecture. But certainly what's a loud silence in that clip is this extraordinary vast space of mutual advantage. When you stepped into the employment market, did you suddenly feel exploited? And then how did you feel during all the other jobs you've had? And I know some of you are now retired. How do you feel about your career? And you might say, well, I felt exploited in my first job quite a bit. Then I didn't feel exploited in my sixth job. Or I felt a little exploited everywhere, but not so much. And of course, we can then come over the top of you and say, well, maybe you have a degree of false consciousness, that you haven't analyzed social forces properly or your own interests properly. And if only you did that, you'd see that you were involved in a disadvantageous way in exploitative relationships more than you allow. Possible too. That's a reasonable conversation to have. But yeah, how do you feel about this? We don't want to introduce too quickly here a concept that is sort of radically out of touch with how somebody's going to feel on the doorstep. Because yes, I think a lot of people are going to feel dreadful about their work, going to feel horrendous about their work, and with high levels of stress and fear and uncertainty and exhaustion and frustration and a lack of meaning, sure. But there's also going to be inevitably a vast space for mutual advantage, both in employee-employer relationships and in other relationships. I'm not exploited by my green grocer on the corner, and I don't exploit them. When I was an undergraduate and I got a semi-meaningful job, I didn't feel exploited. I was doing research for a dictionary of the Middle East, political and economic dictionary. So I was in charge of researching letters A to E. I don't feel I was exploited, unless the exploitation is that I ended up knowing a heck of a lot about the Middle East from A to E and virtually nothing from F to Z. Are my coffee beans at the back there an exploitative product? No, I don't think so. Now you might say it's because you have Ponzi coffee beans and nobody along the chain of production is exploited. But if you take 4 buck beans in the supermarket, they are not easy to make without exploitation along the chain of production. Sure. But a question might arise, maybe we can try to fix this. Maybe we can't, and so on. So, but this is the real conversation. And when you're talking about analyzing human motivation, there's nobody who was more committed to being realistic about that than Karl Marx himself. So the big pillars and indeed expressions of his genius. And it is a kind of faithfulness to Marx to take on the spirit of his thought without, in this particular case, a conclusion of his, and say that there is an enormous space of relations of mutual advantage. There's more we can say, but I think that's enough for Richard's reaction to Richard for today. We've got Jordan Peterson on religion and Nietzsche. I don't know how this is going to go for us, but let's try.
Nietzsche knew that after the death of God, which was something he regarded as really the ultimate catastrophe, the ultimate murder, that 2 things were most likely to happen. One would be a descent into a kind of counterproductive nihilism, the loss of all values, that's how he construed it, and all the psychological disorientation that goes along with that. And the other would be a radical turn towards a replacement totalitarian certainty, which he believed and said would likely come from the radical left in the form of something approximating communism. He nailed that like 1850.
Let's try. In 1850, Nietzsche would have been 6. That's not important because it's okay in public intellectual communication, actually sometimes good and right, to round off dates and help people light up a kind of intellectual historical landscape. I don't do it with Nietzsche myself because Nietzsche is so misrepresented in the culture. Maybe together with Freud, he is the most historically misrepresented figure in Western pop culture. But there's no problem with that. Now there's the problem that I am a professional philosopher, but of course I'm also sick. And that absolutely affects my textual wherewithal. So there are many great philosophical texts where I orient myself like you orient yourself in a house, right? The work is simply inside you. You know where the bathroom is, where the leaks are, where there's a problem with the roof, where the mice were spotted 2 weeks ago under the kitchen cabinet and so on. And that's true of some of Nietzsche's output, but not all of it. For me, I think that what Jordan is talking about comes from Will to Power, which is a book with Nietzsche's writings, but not by Nietzsche. It's a book put together by his sister, from scraps of notes, many of which Nietzsche intended and asked to destroy. That doesn't mean the book has no value, it has enormous value, but that's the context for it. And there is certainly at least one passage there about how socialism, among many other things, is a kind of negation of life, and how its occurrence may be disastrous in practice, with this very significant question mark about how humans would come out of it. But of course, while I can't say about whatever Peterson is saying in this video, if it were taken as a whole, this is something somebody's cut out and put on some kind of motivational YouTube channel. But is this clip in of itself misrepresentative, whatever else Peterson thinks when you take him in with the full lecture there, the full interview there, whatever that is? Yes, it's misrepresentative, because this clip makes you think that the death of God for Nietzsche is something that was bad, something that humans shouldn't have caused, shouldn't have done, and something that'll end in disaster. But Nietzsche's real position is that it's good, it's necessary, so there's no question of it not being done by people, and it may or may not end in disaster. So what Nietzsche is saying is a certain way of truthfully going on may or may not prove sustainable. This is right back to where we started. And so the contemporary political version of this general question of how far a truthful way of going on in relation to important questions may be sustainable is something like, what if the traditional justifications, this is now me, not Nietzsche, the traditional justifications of liberal institutions are gone, but we still need these institutions desperately. What do we do? Can we come up with other justifications? And Nietzsche's answer here is, I don't know. So I'm afraid that particular clip, and you can't blame Peterson on it for that, but is misrepresentative in a profound way, because it implies that what's happened is good, and Nietzsche bad, and Nietzsche thinks it's good, that what happened is something that didn't need to happen, whereas Nietzsche thinks it's inevitable and necessary, and the third, that it's going to be catastrophic, whereas Nietzsche thinks that he doesn't know. He doesn't know. So let's have a bit of Nietzsche now. One of the classic images about the death of God occurs in a beautiful book called The Gay Science. It's one of Nietzsche's 3 great books. The Way Zarathustra isn't a great book, and it certainly shouldn't be a book you ever start reading Nietzsche with, because there's no way you're going to understand what the point of what you're doing is, if that's where you start. But the madman comes down and tells a crowd who already do not believe in God that they've got something wrong. So you see, there is no question in that image at all of giving up or not giving up on religious belief. Nietzsche already assumes that this group that appears in this image, the madman who's walked down and they are in the town center, they're already secularized to some extent. But what he says is, yes, you think you've given up the belief in God, but what you don't realize is that with this giving up, you may also need to give up much Christian morality, much secularized Christian morality. You can't just chop off this epistemic commitment without chopping off the rest. And what Nietzsche is saying is that despite this extraordinarily consequential predicament, it's still good to give up on this belief. It's inevitable anyway, right? And then are these people in the town square going to survive this self-immolation they've caused, which they hadn't realized was a self-immolation, but their sort of destruction of their own moral fabrics? Nietzsche's answer to that, as ever, is I don't know. So along all of these lines, the clip is misrepresentative, I conclude. Nietzsche thinks it's a necessary outcome, he thinks it's a good outcome, and he thinks it's an outcome that could prove catastrophic, but might not. We don't know. But that doesn't stop it from being good, because the only way forward is to reckon with that act of self-immolation and see what comes in its place. Now, what's very striking here is Nietzsche's extraordinary commitment to truthfulness, while at the same time being matched by an extraordinary commitment to suspicion of truthfulness, to worry about what illusions we have about truth, and to worry what ways life in the truth may not be sustainable. That takes us right to the beginning where we started. So I don't know who has survived this and who hasn't, but lots of love and talk very soon.